This is a quick study on the DD, looking at theory, proposing ideas, and looking at actual results in the DD. The Deep Desert needs to be treated like a sport. By nature, PvP is competitive. The open world nature of the Deep Desert doesn't make it any less competitive, it just increases the complexity of the sport, offering more experiences, more strategies, tactics, and opportunities to learn and apply learnings in more ways than one. This is what results in a game that requires the use of your brain. It might sound silly, but take a look at some of the footage of Black Ops 7, for example. You run through the maze, and whenever you get shot, you turn around, eliminate the offender, then keep going. This game is specifically designed to be thoughtless. You don't need to worry about dangers, strategize at how to deal with them, and then through skill and practice try to implement them. You just run through and react to basic stimuli. The part that makes Dune's Deep Desert a game that requires your full attention and thought is the fact that all dangers are present from other players. This is an evolving and living landscape, one which cannot be mimicked by NPCs. It isn't on the rails, which is why it is in your best interest to treat it like a sport. That being said, when you treat it like a sport, you cannot make design choices that discourage the use of thought, because it will create issues with balance and components of the game that contradict itself, resulting in negative experiences that people do not enjoy. What I've noticed from Funcom is that you have a game theory in your heads on how you want the DD and PvP to be played. This isn't a bad thing, it just means that the way you go about achieving it isn't typical of a game. For something like a single-player, on-the-rails shooter, it's absolutely possible. With scripted events, stories, level building, everything from A to Z can be made to tailor a very specific experience. However, the big difference with the Deep Desert is that it relies entirely on players to produce the content. This isn't a bad thing on its own. The problem here is that with a multiplayer game like this, you cannot create the desired content. You can only create the environment in which the desired content is brought to life through people interacting with the game. And so far, it feels like Funcom have been trying to shoehorn a desired end result, something that is only made by players, and while doing so, damaging the very structure and environment that incentivizes the desired results. When you begin to treat the DD like a sport, it opens up the endless possibility of a non-stop fun. Why do people to this day play sports that have been around forever, despite having done the same thing over and over? Why to this day is the DD completely dead, despite only being 5 months old, despite also being a technical marvel compared to simple sports? The short answer? Design. Sports are designed to be competitive and engaging. Competitive and engaging are your two best friends. They should be your number one philosophy when designing the Deep Desert. You can have the most technologically amazing and prettiest game, but without competition and engagement, it will remain little more than a tech demo. Which is why designing PvP with the philosophy of you should always be able to escape when you want is in complete contradiction to what makes a multiplayer game playable. This doesn't mean that you shouldn't be able to escape, that griefers should always have the upper hand. Escape is a facet of counterplay. Counterplay is a result of engagement and competition. Removing the process of gaming for a result will result in no one taking your game seriously. Think for example a sport, at any moment someone decides the game is unfair, calls for a timeout, and demands that all players reset, the ball reset, or they just decide to declare themselves the winner and leave for lunch. Do you think that anyone will take this game seriously? People that take the game seriously are your bread and butter. Do not grieve them. You will appease a selfish loser while grieving anyone who wants to play and have fun, resulting in, you guessed it, negative reviews and no players. Needs and wants are foundational to a player's experience, which is influenced by what the game provides and how it provides it. There are many combinations to this and ways to interpret it, but let's use the most basic example for now. I want to get into all these cool fights, but I also need the material farming to sustain it. The desire to play is influenced by needs and wants that are formed through the lens of the environment of the game, how the game works, and the content available, etc. Needs on their own are important factors in a game, but alone they become tedious, but provide perpetuity. To capitalize on the perpetuity of needs, wants are required. Wants provide an important part of the equation, but on their own can be perceived as shallow, and even in some cases requires a necessity to sustain it. The best outcome is a perfect marriage of both needs and wants. For example,
killed Josh.
I need plastinium, and I want to create an operation to achieve an income of plastinium, for either my benefit, to sell on the market, or for the benefit of my guild. The want of it will stem from the fact that in order to procure plastinium, you need to operate on the field in the PvP zone, where you need to plan, organize, strategize, and execute in a field that is competitive and engaging. If the things I need are outside the field, there is no engagement. Just simply go and get what you need. This turns plastinium from a need and a want into purely a boring need only. It turns thought-driven gameplay into thoughtless chores. Because on the field, in the PvP zone, it is now a competitive game that involves base building, area control, alliances, social organization, logistics, ground combat, aerial combat, and base raiding. Can you see how much of the Deep Desert's potential engagement was sacrificed to turn plastinium into a basic chore? This is why it's super important to take the Deep Desert seriously and treat it like a sport. Anything moved outside of the field of play will directly subtract from the gaming experience. This is a hard truth. It will directly subtract. It adds nothing, only removes potential. Potential that can be exploited into fun, which can be monetized. The fact that there are 3 main resources to gain from the Deep Desert is a good thing. It shouldn't be Spice Melange only. Melange, Plastinium, and Blueprints. Each of these 3 require a different strategy. It offers diverse content, and it splits concentration of competition. For example, if Spice Melange was the only thing to fight over, much of the game's potential will be untouched, simply because Spice Melange only requires a certain amount of specific action, and all focus will be concentrated on Melange, increasing the difficulty and tedium of the competition. Now that we've established that in order to create a good experience for an open-world online game, you need to create the environment that facilitates it instead of the experience itself, this is where we can look into problems like griefing. In an open-world game, all PvP is true PvP. There's no such thing as griefing being unintended gameplay. This is what makes open-world games unique and fun. The problem stems from the environment. Griefing is essentially unbalanced disruption. Disruption that, because of poor design and technical limitations, is easy to dish out and difficult or impossible to counter. The issue is an accumulation of small problems and balance issues: no loss on death, the convenience of VBT, combat imbalance, skill difference, which is just the peak of the iceberg. The problem isn't people wanting to grief. The problem is them being able to do so without reasonable penalty or cost, or with simply too much ease. One other thing to cover is your ongoing process of balance based on data and feedback. You need to be really careful with how you process and interpret your internal data, because it's only half the story. Ideally, your eyes need to be glued to the screen, watching every DD to see how everything happens in real time, and then the numbers can start to make sense. This obviously is quite hard to do on your own, but it can be done by a group of people, and you can even use player feedback to substitute. But you should never replace the reality of feedback with the numbers that you have on a screen. I'm going to use the Cripple Strike nerf as an example. You nerfed this skill so that the game could be played smarter, fairer, with tension, blah blah, and so that there was no pure melee or pure ranged, that they both should be used. And you claim that this was also done based on your data. The reality is that all of these desired effects were already true before the nerf, and the only result of this nerf was that melee is no longer viable. This situation is not to be taken lightly, because it highlights a big disconnect from reality and your perception. What your data didn't tell you is that before the nerf, melee-only builds were enthusiasts/roleplayers, ranged only was meta, and in most PvP, pure ranged was used. People that complained about Cripple Strike didn't know how the game worked. Cripple Strike was easily counterable and escapable. Cripple Strike was the only ability that made melee somewhat viable in PvP. Information like this can only be discovered by witnessing and playing PvP. What's amusing is that by far, this was the smallest balance change, but with the largest disconnect between Funcom's understanding of how the game works and how it really works. To properly facilitate a good experience, you need to be keenly aware of the environment and how it works, because each change you make to the game will ultimately shape the end experience. You cannot remove the viability of Melee and just say that it works because you want it to. It doesn't work like that. Everything needs to be technically viable, or it flat out won't be a positive experience. This is the nature of player-driven content. There is much more to get into, and I could probably sit here all day picking out critical issues that the DD and PvP is riddled with, but I'll end it here for now. What I want is a healthy DD, a positive, fun, engaging experience, and I, as many others, also have only one thing to say: you've missed the mark every time. The easy route here is to insult your incompetence and walk away, which is very tempting. I believe that there are probably some underlying issues or disconnects that can be overcome with help like this, as I want this game to succeed. And I also believe that everyone who turned Dune away in utter contempt is also wanting this game to succeed.